Hello, it's Thursday, which means we're sat here talking to you about software. Hello, I'm Alan, and either side of me are members of the open source team at Anchore. We work on some awesome open source security software, and you can see the logos on the screen there. There's Syft and Grype. Those are two of them. We have some other tools that we may talk about as time goes on. We use this time to go through and triage issues and discuss things, and we're going to discuss the things anyway, so we do it on a video so you can watch. As I said, my name's Alan, and I've got Will, Chris, Keith, and Dan. Hello all. Hope you're all doing well.
Peachy.
Good. For any of the Americans in the audience who are wondering why everyone's working on this day, which apparently is a celebration over there, we defer that celebration to the Friday, so everyone gets a nice long weekend. We do celebrate, we do mark it, but it's our good friends in America get a nice long 3-day weekend, which is lovely for them. Right, what we usually do is go through issues on GitHub. If you want to follow along, you'll find them all on github.com/Anchore. I will try and make sure I paste everything in the chat. If I miss one, then you can probably see the issue number on the screen. I announce all this on our discourse, and there's links to everything here. And the first thing we usually start with is anything marked needs discussion, which there's a lot. So should we start with these? Has anyone got one that they really urgently want to do first before we run out of time?
Nothing urgent. I marked a couple of these myself, but they aren't urgent ones.
Yeah, I'm excited for any and all of the above.
Okay, I'm going to start at the bottom. Just to change things up, it is Syft 3959. 3959. I feel like a bingo caller by 3959. Right. When using Syft to attest an SBOM, I'd like to be able to use one of the cosine built-in predicate types. I feel we've talked about this, have we not? Maybe not. So cosine has some options that maybe we're not. This is a chain guide image is built with AppCo. I can provide one of these as the cosine type. So, Chris, you added needs discussion.
I had needs discussion because when we implemented this, we thought we would just provide the single. I think the predicate type we did was a Syft custom one and not a URI. It seems to have evolved since then, where you can have a salsa provenance. I don't know what salsa provenance 02 is or 1. I don't know the difference between those three.
I love the fact that they're completely inconsistent with their naming. That's just wonderful.
Yeah, it's like a whole hodgepodge of types that you can add into there. Or then I think custom would be Syft. So what we need to do is lift that custom type and probably use either a URI that refers to the SBOM document. We also have one that's registered. I have to go back in the Slack and find where that registration exists for our Syft predicate type. One second. Syft custom type predicate. Does anyone remember in Slack, it was the custom type that people have been asking about us updating the email on? I can't find the message for it. But that type should be probably leveraged for the attestation if we're using custom for it.
I do not.
My Slack is falling down. Let's see.
Let's see. Maybe we can look at cosine to see what we should be doing. Maybe they've updated documentation. I do remember something about this. What you're saying, Chris, with the custom type was like the only one that made sense for us to be able to use at one point.
No, it's too far back. Yeah, I'm sorry for this one, Alan. If I had known, I forgot to even have a document prepared for this guy coming up. Let me do some more investigation on this custom type that we have already registered, and I'll add a comment back on this one to see if that's the one we want to use for custom, or if we want to start adopting any of these other like salsa predicate types for Syft to test. For the community, Syft to test does need some love. It was written about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago. The attestation ecosystem has moved well and far around it, and we have not updated the command recently to meet some of these types. So this is a good kick in the butt to take a look at this after we get a few more things merged on the cataloger side that I'm working on.
Okay.
Oh,
So
nice.
should we pick another one and come back to this when you're...
Yeah, I'm going to remove the news
I'll leave all
discussion
those
from this
tabs
one.
open, but if you want to... Okay. So the next one we're going to have a look at is 4005 on Syft. Let me pop that in the chat. Right. Merge file digests with ones from SBOM cataloger. So when SBOM cataloger finds a new SBOM in a scanned artifact, it appends file digests contents to the respective section of the SBOM being generated. Okay. Perhaps to avoid collisions, paths could be composed of the source SBOM path and the file path itself. Okay. So you're building an SBOM and you're scanning a container, and there might be an SBOM in there, and there's collisions with file names between the two, full file paths between the two. Is that what it is?
It actually gets even more interesting than that. So I'll put down the attestation thing because I worked on this one earlier, and this kind of nerd sniped me earlier in the week. So there's two phases of files that we can have that are outside of the source. To give kind of an idea of what's happening, Syft, when you do a directory scan or a container scan, builds knowledge of all of the file paths of all of the things in the tree that it was told to scan. The first level out from that are things that exist on the file system that were not within the target that we scanned. So think of a directory scan, scanning a certain folder and a bunch of files under that, and then having symlinks or some reference within that scan to go outside of that source and say, I want these files. That's the first level. This one goes an even further level out from that and says, I want to know about files that might not even be on the source system that I'm doing the scan target for, right? Think of when I run the SBOM cataloger and I have a whole host of files and their sums and metadata and everything about them that I no longer, as like the SCA tool, have access to look at, to validate, to even know where they live in, right? And I'm supposed to stitch those into the final document somehow. So that is the ask from DSang, or DSS Engineering, I think is the way that they would do it. And they're part of a Kubernetes distro project called Talos. And Talos Linux is a modern Linux distribution built for Kubernetes. And so what they're doing is in their build system, they're having SBOMs being detected within the images that they're using Syft on, and they want the whole picture of the file digests for both the SBOM cataloger and the thing that they're scanning. And to even throw another loop into it, they're using Syft as a library. So that is the summary of this issue. And that's kind of the summary of that big comment that I just made, outlining the challenges. One more thing that I forgot to mention before we get to the discussion on this one. Another challenge of it is that for the actual formatters that we have, we don't even have decode and encoding kind of like mirror support. You can go through that long comment that I made, and it shows that like if I'm reading a Cyclone DX or SPDX SBOM, there's no way that I could pass a decode and encode between them to pull that information out. We're currently not reading that information into the SBOM correctly. So that's like step one is updating the formatters to do it.
So we don't do bidirectional conversion of
for files, file type components and their digests for both Cyclone DX and SPDX respectively. We don't have a good bidirectional decode encode path currently.
Okay.
So we solve that first. We also have to solve where in those data formats we want to pull this information from if we're detecting Cyclone DX or SPDX. We then have to go, okay, now that we're decoding this information, and we know it's on, file systems that we don't have access to the source, because again, this is an SBOM that we're cataloging. How do we represent that into the final output document that we're getting when we run Syft?
I think this is actually kind of related to something that we talked about last week to some degree. So last week we talked about cataloging SBOMs and then reading in packages. And there are certain types of relationships that we said, hey, this package isn't a package that exists in in the, like, we don't consider it a package that exists. And so we have something that filters out like one very specific thing at the moment, because we think it's something it's referenced in an SBOM, but it's not something that's present. And so this sounds kind of like a similar problem in that what we might be doing is reading in SBOMs and getting information about files that aren't necessarily present. So there's two different aspects. I think the one aspect is what you said, Chris. We should be doing file digests in the formats as best we can, and that's just a, I would consider that a bug in what we're doing there. So we should be, outputting them and reading them in as best we can in the converters in that sense. But then the other part of this is, I think, maybe more interesting to talk about, which is it sounds like what they're looking to do is to put a bunch of bunch of SBOMs in the file system, scan the whole thing, and then get all of that kind of combined together to form the information that goes into the final SBOM, if you will. And so I guess, the question to me is like, what is the right behavior there? And I think the answer is, if we're reading an SBOM and treating it as information that we are surfacing as evidence of packages that are there, the same thing would be true for the files. And so in that sense, I kind of just +1 this issue. But there could be some other nuances that maybe I haven't quite thought through here.
I've got one question. I'm sorry, I joined late. So, yeah, it comes down to this, which on the screen right now, which is the only difference I could think of between like raising evidence of packages from SBOMs, if they said they want the SBOM cataloger, and raising up evidence of files from that same SBOM, is the assumptions in like the underlying Syft document. So here they're creating file coordinates with like a, with here like a URL and saying it came from this builder sources, as opposed to a path. So the one downside so far is using straight up like file coordinates, because file coordinates underneath the Syft way of doing things, they're real paths that we know existed, that do exist in that source that we scanned. So I feel like we want to, like, a way to say files, and here's a path, but it's not necessarily part of any file system that we know of. And probably using that file system ID is maybe the right call there, but that's the only like gotcha I thought about or found when thinking about this. But overall, thumbs up on what you said, Keith, of like, hey, if they're saying they want the SBOM catalog or raise up material from the SBOM, why not file?
Yeah, I wanna tack on to what Keith said. If you scroll down, Alan, to not that comment, but their second comment, or there should be a 2 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, maybe, yeah. So where they consider a subset of the issue on point 4 of their workflow clarification, they're talking about that they have an SPDX SBOM for each package, and so like Keith said, if they have the files in SPDX, we want to just merge those into the forwarding document that they're generating. So I think this issue, as long and as dense as like the prose is actually as simple as getting the formatters to encode and decode in a mirrored way the files coming out of a just SPDX format, and 2, finding a space for them in that final document, which we wouldn't do the PRL of the locations in the way that he's doing it, like via the URL. We would just do the paths that are expressed in those SPDX documents as part of the final product.
Well, and I wonder, going back to the very first thing I said, like, this seems like an analogous thing to the packages that we don't want to include from the SBOM cataloger. Is this another case of we need another place to be able to put information from SBOMs and, have a reference to it, but it's not like an actual Syft file in the same sense that those are the things that we cataloged, but it is something we have a reference to. And if we output SPDX, for example, we could include those with the right type of relationships and or something along those lines.
I think the Syft format needs to have its own way to describe a file and what you just said, Keith, like not something we catalog, but something we pulled in. But I think the conversion up to SPDX, it would just look like a file, and they're like a file with a path, and the relationship would be what signifies that it was found outside of, you know, the original source or the target scan, right? That I don't think SPDX has a way to, like, there's no way to contrive a file path that says I'm a file outside, I'm a file from a different build system. You use just the relationship, and then you infer that it was something that wasn't on the direct, like the original scan. And that's my interpretation. But maybe I don't know, maybe we lift some Syftisms of describing the file in some way outside of that source and post it in SPDX and see how if people like that.
We don't have any relationship, like, so like there's the like, okay, so for an SPDX document, if you have a relationship from the source to a package, you know that that package exists in what you scanned. That's the convention. And is that kind of the same convention you're talking about, Chris, but for files, or were you
Yeah, I'm
talking about
looking.
something else?
Yeah, no, for files. Like, let me find the SPDX relationship that would be good for this. Because you have a file that's related to a package, and you could say it's not file added or file modified. What's the other one? There's like, these are tools. You could do meta file of, because it's like in his way, he's talking about some package YAMLs and patch files that are part of the package that come from the build system. So there's meta file of, or I think that's the only one. You don't want to do dependency of any of those, because those are usually packages. But all of the relationships are just SPDX ref to SPDX ref. So it doesn't make like a real. It's not really a stickler on what kind of components are being linked.
Today, we actually don't create relationships from the source to files that we catalog. I mean, one reason it would just be like there'd be so many relationships, it would be ginormous. So, I mean, especially if you turn on like all files that you catalog, then we would just have a giant set of relationships that don't really have a lot of value, which kind of brings up so Krista, what you're saying, like, well, if today we implicitly, if a file exists in the SBOM for a Syft SBOM, it exists on the file system. So that's true today. And we want to start adding relationships that mean present versus not present. And we don't know which of these relationships it's going to be. I'm a little fuzzy on how that would work. Like, how would we encode to SPDX and then decode back and make certain to take those files and put them in the correct section or interpret them correctly? So if we're saying like have two file sections, what would be the attributes in SPDX? What we would say, these files exist, thus we put it in the file section. These files don't exist, so we put them, elsewhere.
I don't necessarily have the answer to that. I've been kind of looking through the relationships and some of the other spec to see if there's anything that would work for that. But one of the things we could do with SPDX 3 is take the entire SBOM and just put the entire SBOM in the document and have relationships like to an SBOM that has its own set of files related there. So there would be some sort of logical separation of things that, our SBOM is the file system that we read, and then it references some other things that we found that have more information. But that wouldn't really fit in to the kind of model that we're talking about, or what we're doing today with the SBOM cataloger by reading it and ingesting the packages and such. So there'd definitely be a little bit of something different that would need to happen if we were to do that.
Alan, can you go to section 8 of the SPDX spec? And it's like 8.3. Claw, yeah. And then up file type field. I came across this. You see how, yep, under description, just below documentation, you can give the file type SPDX. It is, if the file is an SPDX document. I thought of it, my brain had some wishful thinking. I thought it said file is in an SPDX document. So it's like all these that came from other SBOMs kind of deal, but never mind. That was me just wishful thinking. I guess we would just have to do an other for the file type for this, because all the rest of these kind of assume that the file is within what was scanned. Like I don't know what an SPDX document looks like that has files that are across like a build system, a present system, and like n number of other places that you can amalgamate data from.
Well, the other weirdness here is that SPDX 2.3 files, the name is required to be a relative path, not a URL. So
Right.
these particular things that what we saw in the issue, like we couldn't even really put in SPDX as files the way that they're defined. I mean, according to the spec, as far as I understand it.
That's really awkward. Because Alex, to your point, like even if we solve this on the Syft side on how to express files from other systems in like the Syft format, I don't know currently how you would build this in either an SPDX view or any of the other format views, if it's even possible.
Which kind of tells me you would like drop that information. I mean, which isn't ideal. Which I think that means this author, that who opened this issue would say, hey, this isn't useful for my use case if you can't encode it into something other than Syft JSON. Like I think they're going to want SPDX for this.
Well, so it sounds like we have a couple of questions. I mean, and one of which is if they're putting SPDX documents in with these file names, they're, I think, not technically correct documents. So that's an issue to maybe work through, but maybe if I could ask another sort of very related question. There was a PR at some point to get license information for Rust, I believe, and it downloaded things from the internet and similarly had URLs. Did we have a plan for what to do to represent those in the Syft data model, at least?
There was an outline of a plan. There were still a bunch of unknowns. I'm trying to remember the details, but essentially from like the Syft perspective, it was being able to say, I want an entity that describes something that's remote. I think was what it kind of came down to. So today we can describe the source that's identifiable, a package that's identifiable, and files.
Wow.
And this would be adding a new thing that was like remote resource. And then you'd have the files related to that remote resource. You could say a package is related, was from this remote resource, and that remote resource could have been, say, an archive from a URL. So there'd be an attribute for URL, and on there you could have, related to that could be the files contained within it. We didn't get as far to figure out how you would express like a file that is something that's known to exist from the source versus in the archive that's remote. Like I think it got closed before that point, so that's the unknown aspect of this, which is kind of what we've been circling around too. Let me go find that PR.
Yeah, could anything under that remote section be a file or a package or like some other entity?
Yeah, I think you needed a URL at the very least.
Right.
And it was identifiable. So you can like say, I have this URL, it gets its own ID based off of that URL. So thus you can make relationships between it, that and files, that and packages. So you could say like, I got these files on disk from this archive, for instance. but you wouldn't be able to describe, and these other files were in this archive, or that these source files from upstream were packaged into this archive, went through a compilation step and related to this package, which is, I believe, what the Rust use case was. Like, here's the source files individually. They don't exist in what I scanned. I just scanned, say, the binary. But I want to be able to say, and here is a cargo archive that has the, it's essentially the source tarball that has everything you would need to reproduce this in theory.
I don't want to monkey wrench this because I think what we have is pretty close. It does feel a little bit like we're trying to coerce something that isn't a file into the file section of the SBOM, ultimately. Right? I mean, it has a digest, but the fact that it's a URL, like there is a file, but it's not in here. I don't know if there's a place for that kind of thing, right? That makes a lot of sense. It's like this was a file that was used to build, in the construction of other files. And thus we want to be able to have information about it. And that's legitimate. And that information is stored in here in the form of these other SBOM documents, but they're not really files. I feel like that might be kind of at the crux of this. My kind of misunderstanding. Like, I don't know. I don't feel like we need to boil the ocean. I just want to understand if that's kind of like a fundamental mismatch that might not be a blocker for this one specifically, but it might cause some issues to try to extend this.
Well, I think what they're describing in this case, not everything, but in this case, they are files, right? Like we could go hit that URL, download a file to the file system. Presumably that happened at some point. Somebody used that file and extracted it. So like we would have an actual file that doesn't even need the whole URL. It is like, what if we added some sort of a remote URL like to the file object itself for things that had information about where they were fetched remotely?
I think we get right back to that point of, which is, I think, to what Dan is saying. Well, a file represents something that existed in the source I scanned. And so if it didn't exist in the source that I scanned, then it's like not actually like what a file is today. Like, so yeah, I'm not against adding like a URL attribute, but to files, but then to say that I have a file that has a URL, we wouldn't be able to give it like a path though, because it doesn't actually exist in the source. And that's the crux of the issue. It's not a path in the source. But in this comment here, someone was asking about the Rust side. If you scroll down just a little bit in this comment, yeah. So the problem with this PR was the top little ASCII picture. Like a package had digests, which pointed to file coordinates, and those coordinates were in the archive. So it's like, oh, these aren't real files. These are files that we don't have a way to, and they were attached to a URL too. So in the similar case, but what was proposed, which is I think, Keith, similar to what you're saying, but not exactly the same thing, which is something like this, where you could say, I have a package, you have a new relationship saying like hosted at or remote resource, and you'd have URLs as like a new section on remote resource or something. And that would be identifiable. And then you could say contains, and then this other thing. So like a resource path, which is not itself a file. This gets kind of really close to what we're saying with, you have a file section, and then you have, which is stuff that's present in the source. And then you have another section, which is like, these are paths, but they're not relative to the source. They're useful, but they have nothing to do with the source whatsoever.
I think that would be really useful. I mean, we do have a number of things also with the online enhancement that it could be useful to say, hey, we had these remote resources that were accessed in a similar kind of a way. I mean, that's I think effectively what this is doing too. But
yeah, exactly. So I think this checks some boxes. It checks Dan, what you're saying, like let's not contrive a file to be something that it's not. even though like, yes, if we hit the URL, it is a file. But like if we narrow the definition of file to like, it's a file that's in the source, leave that section alone. So it checks that box. If we add these other things, we have the ability to say, I've got a remote resource at this URL, and it may have these paths in it, but they're not file coordinates from the source. They're just paths. So these are, I think we're saying new sections in the SBOM. They have the same con that we were talking about earlier. We can't encode these necessarily easily into SPDX. I think we might have to bend SPDX a little backwards to get it working, but maybe it's possible. But that means decoding back again. Like we don't have a way to distinguish them. The best I got is using the best I have so far is using the primary purpose, or essentially that package type for SPDX, but that primary purpose to say, oh wait, can you only have one instance of the primary purpose?
I think there are like additional purposes. I think you can, there's a way to have more than one, I believe.
Well, and that's my only other idea is to have, whenever you start relating nodes that are, or things that we are not from the source, you always relate them to other packages which have a primary purpose that is other, and then the comment we have a way to determine what that is. I mean, that's like kludgy, but I mean, that's the only way I can imagine you'd express that in SPDX. The 2.3 is what I'm thinking of. So
Yeah.
Yeah, or extend the file element definition to be able to accommodate this type of, doesn't have a path, does have a URL, does have a digest, is present, yes or
Yeah,
no.
but
Stuff.
I mean, you're gonna run into files that don't have a URL that just have a path that isn't on like the source scanning system. So if you don't have like the URL source, you just have a random like relative path for the name, and you have some digests. I think those have to go into like their own section to not get mixed in with like what was scanned. I just think they have to be broken out on the Syft, in the Syft format itself. You can't mix them in with the source scan.
Right, and I think we could just, have relationships from the packages that we've ingested to, and then we could figure out, whenever we output formats, like what we need to do there. I think like what you're saying, kind of like what I mentioned at the beginning of like splitting them out into separate locations, like we kind of talked about for the packages, and yeah, I think thumbs up on that for sure.
sounds like we might have a path here for this one.
Yeah, I think it's some design / prototyping on what that new section of the Syft, of at least the Syft format looks like. We can't, Alex, would you want like, okay, if we were to add this into the Syft format, like proposals on what it looks like both in SPDX and CycloneDX, or do we just solve it for Syft first and then kind of build the next step after we've solved it for that?
Well, and that's what I was trying to say earlier. Like this particular issue, I kind of is implicitly saying they need this in SPDX. So that we need to think through this in SPDX. Because I think what they're outputting is eventually also SPDX. So yeah, we could say, let's stop short and solve it for Syft, but because we have way more options on the Syft side than we do on say SPDX, we may easily corner ourselves pretty early. Like we might finalize a Syft solution that just doesn't work for anything. So I think we want to think through this and at least the SPDX side. We should look at CycloneDX. However, I'm pretty certain that there is not a way to express this in Cyclone. But we should look just to convince ourselves, is that true or is that not true? I mean, I take the action to write a response to this one, since I gave this a lot of thought in the Rust one, so I can maybe do some copying and pasting at the very least.
I just followed up linking our actual live stream where we've just talked about this, and I linked the Rust PR as like a reference where we've also talked about this kind of thing outside of the source before. So we can write more detail in a follow-up comment, but it's here. People have people have our thoughts in video form.
Sweet. Are we done? Okay. So
2 for 2.
Going up, right. A problem with Wolfie images. When scanning Wolfie images, this is Syft 2691.
Right, brother.
GHSAs have unknown severity.
So, yeah, so I think I've got some more detail commented on here. So I think it needs discussion because Wolfie is similar to Alpine and a couple other distros in that they publish a list of fixes rather than a list of vulnerabilities. So the way you search for vulnerabilities in an Alpine distro is you search for vulnerabilities in NVD, like the overall National Vulnerability Database, and then you subtract from those the ones that are fixed. So that's what they've published, and they've started publishing that they've fixed GHSAs instead of just publishing that they fixed only CVEs. However, sometimes they publish that they've fixed an unreviewed GHSA. And right now, Grype has no knowledge of unreviewed GHSAs. They're sort of in this like unofficial state. I think there's basically a cron job that downloads all new CVEs and assigns them a GHSA ID and chucks them in GitHub somewhere. And then somebody eventually reviews them and they turn into real GitHub security advisors when they get reviewed. But you can see how this has at the top GitHub advisory database. So pointing at my own monitor /unreviewed /CV 2024-2961. So the reason this has unknown severity is because Wolfie or Alpine have published a SecDB fix that says, hey, in this package version of whatever glibc in this case, we fixed GHSA 22Q4 whatever. And we don't have any data for that. And then I wanted to, so that's all the context, that's all the background. And then I think I had a couple of possible paths forward. So we could fetch unreviewed GHSAs to learn, because like what I would like to do is drop these because they're unreviewed GHSAs, and we probably have the CVE anyway. But I can't necessarily do that because without downloading the GHSA, which we don't presently have, I can't check what CVEs the GHSA is an alias of. So I can't drop it. I can't necessarily safely drop it because it's possible that they fixed a GHSA that's not an NVD. Such a thing could theoretically happen. Or we could like look through the data and try to prove that there are never ever GHSAs unless there's also a CVE. And then we could just, when we're building the database, we could just drop GHSAs from the Wolfie data, which would make the database a little bit smaller and fix this problem certainly directly. So I wanted to talk about that because it's a little bit of like right now the providers in right now Grype's database providers don't really know about each other, with the exception that we do a last minute pass to backfill severities for CVEs from these SecDB based distros, because they just have fixed information. They don't have any severity or description or anything. So we backfill that. However, I tried just changing that. If you go to the code link there, I tried just changing this to fill in the missing severity also from CVEs or also from GHSAs, but we don't have it because the GHSAs are unreviewed. That's the dilemma. So anyway, does anybody
Well-
have any suggestions for how to handle this?
I have a, I mean, maybe. So maybe within the Wolfie provider, we could fetch unreviewed GHSA. Actually, no, let me ask a question first. So for any GHSAs that are being reported in the Wolfie data and we're trying to fill in missing severity, can we get that working without pulling any additional data? So it's a GHSA that has a known CVE.
Well, we don't know whether it has a known CVE without pulling additional data because it's just a GHSA number.
So I'm gonna ask it a different way. Like if say that we had processed, so how this fill in unknown severities works is it like goes back into the database and says, hey, we've already written NVD records, and we could change this to say we've already written GHSA records as well.
That's
so
true.
like those two are processed first. And we have for the GHSA records that we processed from that provider today, a mapping of GHSAs to CVE IDs. And I know this doesn't
Right.
work for the unreviewed, which is okay. My question first is, well, given that we do that, so we process GHSA first, and we update this fill in missing to go back in the database when we see GHSAs. Well, I guess maybe that's the answer to my question. I think there's probably enough information right there to make this work for reviewed GHSAs.
Yes.
And
Reviewed
for-
GHSAs are easy to do.
And then unreviewed, I think this comes down to the Wolfie provider doing the extra work, right? Because we don't have value in unreviewed GHSAs elsewhere. And I'm with you, like you have an option of, hey, do we drop GHSAs entirely? So that's option A, we'll say. Option B is, well, the Wolfie provider could pull in the unreviewed GHSAs and fill in that related vulnerability. So if there was a CVE ID, we'll fill that in the provider, such that this fill in missing severity could pick up on that and use NVD, just like we do for everything else.
Right.
That's option
So
B.
yeah, so I think so in other words, we could have the Wolfie provider download specifically the unreviewed GHSAs that it encounters, or download all of them because the Wolfie provider doesn't have any GHSA state, so it doesn't know whether it's reviewed or not. So it could download. I guess I think I didn't completely follow. I'm trying to summarize that back to you, and I just don't have it.
Yeah. So it's basically have the Wolfie provider do the work of getting the GHSA to CVE mapping within that provider, so that later the fill in missing severity can use that information to say, I have a GHSA, hey, but there's a related CVE already. Go use that to normalize over in Grype TV. But it's basically have the provider do the work.
So the provider would download all the GitHub advisories or all the GitHub advisories it finds and note their alias.
I think it would be download only unreviewed ones because those are the ones that we think.
But how does it know which one? It's the Wolfie provider. It doesn't have any knowledge of what GitHub ones are reviewed or unreviewed. Agreed.
This would be go to the GitHub security advisory, either the GitHub API or via the repository, and only fetch all unreviewed ones. And then whenever you run across a GHSA when processing Wolfie records in that provider, you look it up, and if you don't find one, that's okay. It's probably reviewed then.
Okay. It might be that there aren't huge numbers of them and that it's more performant to just download every GHSA that we actually find in the data. Because I think there are many more unreviewed GHSAs than there are GHSAs referenced in Wolfie data. Okay,
true.
that makes sense. So we download it, and then instead of like trying to copy the whole GHSA into the provider state, we just fill in the like related vulnerabilities field before we write it to the database. Okay, can we add that? Let me add that to the issue here. So I'm gonna go away and type before I forget everything we just said, and we can go on to the next one.
Sweet.
And I'm not
Thanks, Phil.
dismissing option A as a side note. So it might be worth still chatting through. Do we not even want these GHSAs here? I kind of don't know the answer to that question. I think that needs investigation. Someone to
It
really
might-
go look to see what the impact is there.
Did we talk? Do we have as needs discussion also the -- by CVE issue? We might have that as needs discussion, and we might have just done a really good segue to it.
Good question. So there's a, I don't have that issue handy.
Yeah,
It's a Grype issue, right?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's maybe one tab over.
There it is.
And
Right,
1454.
and so this is one of the things. Like the reason I bring this up is I think eventually, like, we have a few places in Grype where we use the ID from the data set we matched on. So some concrete examples are if we've matched on a GitHub security, like if we search data that we got from GitHub and we found a vulnerability, its ID will start with GHSA, right? Same for Amazon Linux, it will start with ALAS. Oracle Enterprise Linux, it will start with ELSA. And I think this is generally like kind of not what people want. I think people think of the CVE ID as like the real one and are just surprised when we give them something else. And so I kind of wanted to segue into this because it might have made more sense to talk about this first, right? The fact that we're surfacing incomplete GHSAs in the Wolfie provider is sort of a consequence of the fact that we're surfacing GHSAs in the Wolfie provider at all. And so I'm wondering if like in the long term, it makes sense to say we're only going to print the string GHSA if it's a GHSA that has no CVE attached to it.
In other words, like how by CVE works today.
Yeah, I think we've talked about a couple times that like in Grype 1.0, like -- by CVE is the default behavior. But so that was sort of a backwards way to get to this issue, but it might be so in other words, the Wolfie provider, we could just say like, okay, I'm going to fetch the aliases. I have GHSA foo as fixed in this package version. I'm going to fetch the aliases for GHSA foo, and if one of them starts with CVE and I have that one at the same version, I'm just going to drop the GHSA. I think that might be the cleanest solution.
Are you talking about
Wait.
at database write time or at Grype presentation time?
I was talking about a database write time, but we could do it later too.
Well, yeah, I mean, in my head, you kind of want, if I back up and if I think through like the implications of this by CVE flag, I think it kind of turns into a more generic one. I think probably by Grype 1.0, this is a lot of hand waving. I think it would probably just drop to just a -- by flag. And by default, it would have a value of CVE. So you could pass a value. So by CVE or by EUVD or by GHSA. But like I think the key change is where that default value is by CVE. But at database write time, we kind of want all of those aliases. We want to be able to say like, oh, I found this CVE. Oh, and I know that this is this GHSA, and I know that it's this EUVD, etc. Like you want kind of all of those associations so that at presentation time, you can make the decision of, oh, I want to orient everything by X or by Y. Which is why I kind of lean away from making a decision at database write time to drop some of this when it might be the association's useful at presentation time.
That makes sense. Yeah, we also have to sort of solve the like ragged mapping, right? Because alias is an array, right? So GHSA could be an alias for more than one CVE. I don't know if this is seen in the wild, but with other data providers, it definitely is. That like, you know,
No, I've seen it scanning a couple images where if I use this flag, my just list grows disproportionately because it references so many. It's like a one-to-many relationships with the identifiers.
Yeah,
I
and
didn't
part
think
of
that was the
this,
behavior of the flag today. Maybe it is.
well, it might be because, and part of what's, implicitly baked into here is how we decide to merge records that have the same identifier. And this is like a whole nother slew of topics. Like, do we present by, so today when you are getting Grype results, you're getting a match, which is a tuple of, a vulnerability to, a package. And, and we want to do better in terms of being able to present by orienting by package or orienting by vulnerability, because if depending on like who you are, like what your role is, you might have totally different needs there. So like a system admin might want to know by package, like what are the minimum number of packages I need to update on my system. So cool, it might be that I have 100 matches, but it might only be for like 5 packages. So like I just need to update these 5 packages. But it might be a security team that needs to make a report that says what CVEs, what's our risk right now, what are the CVEs that I need to remediate. And so yeah, they care about packages, but they really care about which CVEs, their severities, et cetera. So they might want a by CVE ranking because they don't care about the tuple per se. So I guess long story short, like what is implicitly baked into this, reorienting the results by, it affects how we merge records, whether it be the matches themselves get larger or that the presentation totally changes based off of just the same match records we have today. We kind of don't know the answer until we go and explore that, but the end state is supposed to be, we want to reorient results with this by flag, but we also want to provide better output capabilities. So by package, by vulnerability, etc.
Okay, so it sounds like what we've decided is that the Wolfie bundle provider should make some GitHub API calls, and then this issue that's on the screen now requires like a lot more UX design and is maybe its own topic with its own subtopics. Is it sort of where we're at?
And subtopics. Yeah.
Okay.
All good.
Yeah. I mean,
we
so
don't have long, so can you pick a small one? What's this one? Is this a small one or is this not? Differing results in Grype before/after 0920. Grype 2707.
I think there's, yeah, so this, if you look in that little bit of SBOM in the Perl for the Debian package curl, it's got distro equals buster. And I think what's going on is that we have enabled people to specify different distros on different Perls in case they have an SBOM that has elements from more than one distro in it. And then Grype isn't very clever and is about searching for distro equals buster. It doesn't find anything. It should find like Debian 10, but it doesn't. And so I think if you scroll down, what I wanted to discuss here is what sort of behavior we think we should do with regards to distro searching, because Grype is sort of in between where some of the behavior with regards to distros is driven by what's in the database, but there's also some like hard-coded switch statements saying like, oh, hey, we don't support Rocky super well yet, so just pretend they typed RHEL if you see Rocky. And so I think that was the question. I think if you scroll down a little bit, there's like, this, sorry, I'm getting, so I was thinking like, does this issue mean it's like, is the way to solve this issue to go ahead and stop having a list of distro types in source code and have a list of distro types only in the database, and then where we do something that looks up a distro, do queries where we're like, oh, hey, is this distro thing a version? Is it a Debian codename? Is it an Ubuntu codename? Is it name hyphen version? And so it could also be that the result here is just like, you shouldn't have distro equals Buster in your package URLs because Buster is not really a distro. It's a code name for a version of a distro. But the Perl spec is sort of loose in that regard. So we might want to be permissive there. So that's sort of the discussion, is like the issue is basically that Grype is a bit confused by the question distro equals Buster in the package URL qualifiers, and searches for a distro literally called Buster and finds none, and therefore doesn't find any matches on here, which is a bit silly. But like, maybe even however we go, we could special case like code names for recent Debian and Ubuntu versions, because people might just do that. But yeah, anyway, I feel like I shared a lot of context. What do other people think?
Well, so I wholeheartedly agree on the like get rid of hard-coded things on the client side, because like, you know, with the DBv6 schema, we went a long way towards getting rid of a ton of that. Something I'll note that hints at like the A path here is that if you do Grype -- distro Debian : Buster and pass a Perl with no distro equals, it works. So it actually does the correct lookup, because there are smarts on like the DBv6 side to go do that lookup. What is lacking right now is understanding when Buster is being interpreted as a name of a distro versus a version of a distro. So something that's not working is for that same thing as if you do -- distro Buster. And like that should work. It doesn't work today. But say that did work today, I believe the Perl side would also probably start working. But I think the long story short is we're probably missing just a little bit of logic to handle, hey, if I see a name, it might not be a name, it might be a code name too. So it's just one extra retry. So we're actually probably 95% the way here.
Yep. Thumbs up.
So we're most of the way here. So we're not going to use this issue to like, we eventually want to totally remove the like type switching on what is and isn't a distro name.
Oh yeah.
But that's not necessarily part of this issue, or
No.
Why would we have to leave that? Could we?
No, I think we should. I think we should remove it, but removing it seems like more than 5% of the work. So I was trying to square that with the assertion that we're 95% of the way there.
We're 95% of the way there if you don't remove it and just do the extra retry and keep the things there.
Yeah. Okay. So let me expound on that more, because I'm
You have
both
2
in
minutes.
agreement of. Okay. I'm both in agreement of removing those, but then I'm also saying that to get this little part working is probably most of the way there. It's probably gonna be a little bit of work. Grype 1.0, we want to change the distro object, and that's where these types are coming from, to really be driven purely off of the data. So that would be the release IDs from like the etcos release files, and not by like bespoke strings in the client side. And so that means we could just delete this whole set of types here entirely. So we want to do it. It just so happens that we can probably fix this before we delete those types. But I agree, in our very near future, like before Grype 1.0, we want to delete those types. We don't want those on the client side.
Sweet.
Okay.
Grype 1.0, here we come. We're at what? Grype 0.94. We're getting closer. When are we going to have Grype 99.999? That's like, are we going to just keep doing that as we get closer and closer to 1.0?
Hopefully not .999, because that means we had a lot of patches with no new features, but maybe 0.99 is close in the future.
5.9s version.
Yeah. Right, 5.9s. It's not what you think it is. We messed up. We're sorry.
Somebody's
Wonderful.
gonna definitely. Someone's gonna open up an issue to say, "Guys, are you okay?"
Yeah, wellness check on the tools team.
The release nudger in our Slack achieved AGI a little too soon and just started bumping it nonstop to look productive.
Right. On that note, thank you, everyone. That was a deep one. Have a great weekend. I'll see you all next week. See you later. Take care, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.
Take care.